Hi everyone, this is a quick introduction to Clip Studio Paint if you are a true beginner. This is if you would like to animate with Clip Studio Paint specifically. I'm going to be covering how to lay out your workspace for most efficient and clean ways of working, just for animation's sake. I'm going to be talking about creating cels, drawing, all the things. I will be approaching this all as if you haven't ever opened Clip Studio Paint before. And so if you're somewhat experienced, this may be a bit of a refresher for you, but the animation tips will all be very specific to help you get started on your animations as quick as possible. This will not be covering advanced topics like the animation table or the light table, as some call it, but maybe I will make another future video as a succession to this to explain more complicated animation tools and tricks. For now, this will just be about creating a most basic animation with Clip Studio Paint X. And so let's get into it. First, you will actually be seeing something not quite like what I have here. This is the peak, or at least what I find the peak experience for working in Clip Studio Paint as far as layouts go. But if you're opening this software for the first time, it's going to look potentially a little different. Something a little bit like this. This might be how it looks. It might also look a little different. That's okay. If it looks different to you, that's fine. The point is I want to highlight a few things to get started with. The first, in order to make this all make sense, is to actually open a file before we get into any reorganizing. So let's do that now. You're going to go up to the File tab up here. You're going to click New. And I have it already pre-selected for the animation, but really what's going to happen when you open up your file for the first time is it's going to have the illustration selected in the new box. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to go over to the far right and click on Animation, the little video play box there. Once you click on this, the file type for animation will be pre-registered here. You may want to change some settings. A 1920 by 1080 is a great place to start, and the resolution, in my understanding, does not matter as much for animation, as it more refers to people who are trying to print their illustrations or get a high pixel density for illustration. So 72 will work perfectly fine, at least for today. Then you'll want to go over here and check frame rate. You can choose either 24 or 12. I recommend either of these to start out with. 12 will be a little bit easier to potentially to understand in the beginning, but 24 is more standard for a lot of animations. I am more familiar with 24, so I will be using 24 today, but just know that 12 is a bit simpler to get started with, as you will need less drawings per second to make an animation work. But for now, I will just be using 24, and we'll click OK. Now, we have a new blank file ready to go, but we need a few things in place before we get started. So with this default setting, I find it somewhat hard to process what I do need and what I don't need for animation. So let's delete a few things. First, what I want you to do is click on Window, this tab up here. And I think it's best to actually get rid of things that you don't necessarily need here and potentially along the side. Let's click on Window. For example, layer property, I believe we do not need. There are a few other ones like search layer where you can also drag it out and click X. This is a bit more satisfying as far as ways to get rid of things, so I just start to drag things out and click them out. As you can see, as I get rid of them, a lot of them are more related to creating manga or comics or other such things. A lot of these are just clog, and if you don't mind them, you're welcome to keep them, but for me, I find it to be a little bit inefficient to have them, as I find myself clicking around way too much on things that I will never use in animation. And if I do, I know that I can go back to Window to find them. So I get rid of just about everything, including the hidden tabs, although again, if you find this to be a little too much work or a little too confusing, you're welcome to ignore this step. I like to keep just the navigator in the upper right. And again, if you find yourself not being able to find it, let's say if I got rid of it by accident, then what you can do is you can go up here and find it again. So you can see here that we have navigator. Then you can click it usually and hover it over the docking system that you would like. I usually like to have it in the upper right corner, so when it looks like this, and I'll dock it right there. Animation cels I generally prefer to have hidden, but on hand, but since we aren't going to be covering animation cels today, you are welcome to just get rid of it for now. History is another thing that can be helpful to have because it will show you all the actions that you've taken as far as the actual in-game or in program tools or options, right? If I draw here, it's going to record every single move. And so it can be nice to get rid of things or have it as a fancy undo button if you'd like. But again, I find it a little easier to either use hotkeys or use these buttons up here in the upper corner than to use the history tool or the history window. So I remove it. Now on the right hand corner, you should only really see remaining layer and navigator. And again, if you don't see them there, I would recommend finding them in the window tab. So layer, navigator. Then over here, you're going to find on the left-hand side, or at the very least somewhere along the corners of your Clip Studio Paint window, you're going to be finding Subtool Brush. I'm right-handed, so I like to put them all over here where my right hand usually rests. Makes it a little easier to grab new things and new tools when it's off to the side. So I will put it over here to the right of the navigator and the layer tab. Tool property will also go over here as well. And tool property relates to what kind of setting each and every brush will have, including brush size. Because tool property includes brush size, I like to get rid of brush size here, as I find that it's a little redundant. There are also useful hotkeys that you can discover later on that I will also cover that will usually help shortcut this much faster. Over here we also have the color wheel. The color wheel is useful, but not necessary, so often I like to put it next to the navigator or even behind it. You can also just place it above it. Finally, I will get rid of these. To some, this might seem kind of like a boring step, but I do find that not a lot of people talk about workspace flow when beginning their tutorials on a new program. So if this is your introduction to Clip Studio Paint as a whole, then I find that it might be quite useful. The last big thing that I want you guys to focus on, besides the actual animation tools themselves, is going to be the toolbar here. This toolbar is very similar among other digital art programs, so if you have used stuff like Photoshop or Krita or FilePaca, anything like that, this is going to be quite a similar experience. It's going to just have a very long, usually skinny, row of different things that you can use, and I promise this will probably be the most useful of them all. You can also stretch it out if you find it easier to see view as a more wider zone, but I usually will dock it over here and then squish it back to a long thread here. So now this is a little similar to what I normally use in my Clip Studio Paint process. I have them almost all docked to the right hand corner because I am right-handed. If you're left-handed, you might find it more useful to have it on the left-hand side, but whatever is most visually and realistically capable or efficient for you will work best. Now we can start to focus on things that will help us animating. Down at the bottom, we can find that there is another kind of hidden toolbar. You can look at the bottom left-hand corner here where my mouse is pointing, and you can see that as I hover over, it says timeline. You'll want to click on that. If it's not visible to you, again, you'll be finding what you need in the window tab. You can go down to about here, and there's a little section that's kind of dedicated towards things that are very much related to animation. Timeline is here. You can also see X is a thing that will trigger it, although I do find that some shortcuts and hotkeys have multiple functions, so I find it best to go to the Windows tab here. So timeline is there. All sides view you can get rid of for now if you have it docked in the hidden section there in the other tab. And so now we just have timeline. Once you have timeline in view and you can see what I see here, I can see both like a little white square and a 1, and this is a drawing or a cell, also known as a frame, right here ready to be drawn on. If you don't, for example, see that, maybe you would see something similar if we delete this to this, you can fix that pretty quickly by clicking this button here, New Animation Cell. So again, you'll want to look right below this kind of back and forth horizontal scroll bar here for the whole workspace. Right below that, in this little docking area here, you want to click this, and there you go. You'll have New Animation Cell. Now you'll notice something interesting happens when you create that. Once I deleted that by right-clicking and deleting, what happened is there's actually still frame number 1 in existence somewhere. But what happened is that as I deleted it, because when Clip Studio Paint creates a new cell or a new frame, it actually is linked to our Layers tab. And so this brings me to my next big point about Clip Studio Paint. This is a very unique quirk of Clip Studio Paint's animation function, and other softwares handle it differently. This is how you manage the different layers in Clip Studio Paint as far as just normal drawing goes, right? But it also has an animation folder, and this is where all of your linked animation frames exist. They exist essentially in 2 places, here on the timeline, and then also here in the Layers tab. It can feel a little bit annoying and confusing at first, and it did take me a bit of time to kind of get used to it. But once you realize that both of these are connected and you have to keep an eye on both of these, it gets a little bit easier, and frames can go missing a little less. So when I delete a frame, like I did now, what I want to be cautious of is that if I delete it here, I must also go to the animation folder and delete it there. Click Delete Layer. Now you can see the animation folder has 0, and when I create a new animation cell, it will begin at 1 again. Again, to create a new frame or a new cell, you want to click this button here. And to delete one, you can right-click, delete, but then make sure to do the same in the Layers tab. This works in reverse, where if you delete it here, you want to make sure to go over here and delete this floating frame here, just to make sure there are no hidden frames that you miss later on. But now let's go back to just our blank animation cell. Once we have this, we can start to explore other things in the timeline area. Let's talk about actually just drawing on the frame here or on the cell, because that's the fun part. You want to take your tool of choice, if you're using a pen or some sort of tablet, right? You'll want to then start drawing inside the software. As long as you've selected the right frame and the right layer, you can then start to draw. Usually by selecting one, you've selected the other. So let's say you can draw a smiley face, or my favorite to teach animation, at least lately, has been to draw a ghost. Ghosts are a simple but cute way of drawing something new for the first time in the software. The other nice thing about a little cartoon ghost is that it floats. So as we draw and experiment with new animations, we don't have to worry too much about complex movement, and it will still look pretty cute. So I'm going to draw a ghost, and again, to draw this, I just draw a little rainbow-like shape, 3 little lumps at the bottom, and then a smiley face or emotion of your choice. You can make him angry, or you can make him sad. Give him a hat. Anything you'd like. The key is to have fun as you're learning, if you can. Once you have your ghost of choice, then we can start to explore a few other things about the animation timeline. First, I want to take note of, before I move past it too quickly, the tools I was using to create Mr. Ghost was the little brush tool over here. So if you're not so sure which to use, I would recommend the brush. It might throw at you a lot of different brush tools. Maybe it might look like this, like this, like this, or like this. As you can see, I'm switching between different brushes. This is by the subtool, the subtool brush right here. And if you don't have that open, I would recommend, again, going up into the Window tab, finding subtool brush. This will change depending on what you have selected. If you click it again, you can see that it says subtool pen. It changes depending on what tool you have selected. The subtool is generally just a window meant to change the features of whatever tool you're using. So for example, if I switch to the selection area tool or the marquee tool known in other programs, you'll notice that I can switch between rectangle, ellipse, lasso, polyline, a selection pen, all sorts of things. So generally, the subtool is great to have open because it reveals a whole other host of things that you can do with just one tool. Now, with the brush tool, you'll want to experiment a bit just to see which one is your favorite. Clip Studio Paint has a large variety of brushes, and a lot of them are very much worth checking out. But I would not generally get too stressed about what kind of brush is the right brush. As long as it's opaque enough for you to see what you're doing, it's fine. The other tools you can experiment with are the pen tool, which has the G pen, which is a great tool for a nice opaque line, or markers, which also have a really great selection of different really strong brushes and tools to use. The pencil tool is also great in case you want to experiment with something a little bit more sketchy and lighter. Once you've found your brush or tool of choice, you'll want to stick with that for the rest of at least this tutorial, and then experiment as you have fun and explore the program on your own. Then, after we've discovered our tool, draw your guy, and in order to erase, you can do a couple things. So let's say I wanted to erase some part of this guy. Maybe we wanted to erase his face. What I would do is use the eraser tool, which you can find again down below, usually the sparklies or the last little brush here. It's also usually above the little blend tool, right here. You can usually also hotkey it by clicking E. The eraser tool is very useful, and you'll find yourself using it quite a lot. As I said earlier though, there's also an undo button up here in the upper tab, kind of below, like the story, animation, layer, all of those little clickables right there, those menus. You can find these little arrows back and forth up here. So once you're happy and you find yourself comfortable with the erase and the brush tool, we can move on. So now that we have that, we can also now focus on working the timeline. The timeline is down here, and there's a couple things I want you to note. Besides being able to create cells and doing a few other things that we'll kind of revisit later, you can also move around back and forth using this little red bar. You can drag and drop it to kind of scan back and forth. So I'm holding my mouse and dragging it back and forth, back and forth. Or you can also just click a random area and go there instead. So it's a very versatile tool. If you've ever used any video editing programs, this is quite similar. The thing I would recommend is, depending on what frame you started with and what you told your software in the beginning when you created a new file, our timelines might look slightly different. What I would recommend is playing next with the zoom out and zoom in button. This is a point of actually, honestly, great confusion in the beginning, because you might think, oh, well, this is all I have here. But in reality, depending on how many frames you told it to create in the beginning, you might have many frames. I generally have it default set to creating 200 frames, which is kind of what I have it set to. So I have a lot of room to work. But honestly, especially for this first one, we're not going to need that many. So again, I would recommend zooming all the way out if you can, and finding the little blue bar right there. If you can see it, this little blue area, when I hold it, it becomes pink. So I'm going to drag it way back to maybe the 25 mark here. And then I'm going to click the zoom in button. And you want to make sure to zoom in almost all the way until this little zoom in button right here is grayed out. So you want to go all the way in, like that. Now you can see each and every frame in a much closer, experienced way than if you were zoomed all the way out. See, you can see how it cuts out. You can only see 1, 13, and 25 from here, at least in a close-up way. But when you zoom in, you can see all of them. So I find that's very helpful if we're just working on a short animation. Now, this little blue bar is great because it also helps to restrict where this little red area goes. This is the only playable area that you can see. Now, you can see I just accidentally did something that actually brings me to a great point. Another thing that you can control when it comes to Clip Studio Paint's animation features and timeline is where the frames hold and stop. This is different than where the playback range is. The playback range is these two blue bars here, so I can move these anywhere along this timeline and it will just play that area. But the actual hold frames is a different story. So if I extend this out, and let's say I now zoom out, and I can see that there are little tabbies at the end of each of these dark gray areas. You can see that there's a dark gray box right here that my cursor is gesturing to. So right here at the end, I can drag this in and out, in and out. What this does is it tells the program this is what to hold. This is where the animation should play. And there's a great way to show this off. Let's say we wanted Mr. Ghost to end here, and then we want the paper, which funnily enough also is affected in the timeline. I can put paper, which is essentially our background, back and forth as well. So let's say we want paper to end at 31, and then we want our animation folder, so our ghost, to end at 67. And let's say we let the animation bar, so the blue bar, stay here at 151. What's going to happen, as you may have already gotten a preview of, when I click play, this white background and eventually the ghost will disappear much sooner than the animation is told to stop. So if I were to export this and play this and put it on the online, my animation would disappear much faster than I think I would like it to. So what I'm going to do is, now we're going to click pause, and I'm going to zoom back in just a little. Now I want these to go way out there. Way out there. For me, especially with short animations such as this, there isn't really a reason to just not have these extend to the end and past the blue bar. Generally, you will want these to always be past the blue bar, except for choice situations, which honestly you'll run into probably much later in your animation journey. For now, I would say gold rule of thumb, have these way out there. Blue bar, have it way in here. And the nice thing is, even as you're creating, if you are creating very long animation, you can always extend these out as far as you need them to go. So there's no rush, and you can always add more. Now that we have this all set up, we can explore a few other fun things about the animation timeline. The other thing that I like to keep toggled on is this button, loop play. This is what tells the program just to loop it back and forth. So let's bring this in a little closer so this will go a bit faster. I'm going to click this. And without loop play selected, it just stops. It plays it once and stops. But in order to get a better sense of our animation, often we need to watch it back and forth over and over again. So by default, I will have loop play selected. Right? So that's very useful. The other thing I like to have toggled on, at the very least at the beginning, is onion skinning. So onion skin is kind of bringing us into another talk. I like to click this on. And right now we don't have another frame, so not much happens. But let's try adding another frame and seeing what goes on. I'm going to go back to frame number 2. So I'm zooming back in, and I'm going to click frame number 2 right here. And we're going to click a new animation cell. And boom, now Mr. Ghost has turned blue. Or purple, whatever shade of cool color you decide that is, it's going to turn that color. And that's great, that means it's working. And if we turn onion skin off, which is this little button here, it disappears. If you are unfamiliar, onion skinning is the tool the animators use to see the prior and next frames in case they wanted to draw something in between. 2 frames, right? We can experience this as we start to draw. So what we draw next is going to be influenced by frame number 1. Generally, there are a couple ways to go about it. One is what's called straight ahead, and this is just animating the next frame in the sequence. And you can do this by just saying, okay, well, I want him to go this way, and maybe a little bit up because he's a ghost, so he's floating. So maybe we draw it here. We do our best to match, but we aren't too precious with it. Right? And so now, in order to go back and forth between 2 frames, you can go over here and again to this little top bar in the timeline. You can go back, forth, and forth. Boom, boom, boom. So that's great. Now, the other way of going about it, especially with something simple like this, is you can actually, I'm going to delete this, go in and go over your existing frame. This won't work for everything, but it is a nice way to get started. So you can trace over your previous frame, adjusting as you like. So there we go. Then you can have this guy go over here. Now, how did I do that? So, a couple ways. One, you can always go over here to your toolbar and click this little, almost like a compass, right? It looks like this. And that's the Move Layer tool. So let's go over here to the Move Layer tool. What we can do is then use that to have the ghost go up. And this just moves the whole layer up. Now, sometimes this can cause technical difficulties, and so if you're finding yourself this isn't doing what you want it to, it's not moving just the ghost, it's moving something else as well, then we can do it a different way. And this way is honestly a little bit more versatile as far as what you can do with it. So if you haven't used other drawing softwares, this might be a new tool, but if you have, this is actually a very similar tool to what you might have experienced in Photoshop or other similar programs. So you'll want to go into Edit and find the Transform tool, and then click for Free Transform right there. Then you'll want to go up, or wherever you want Mr. Ghost to go, and click Enter. And there we go. The nice thing about the Free Transform tool is that it's got a lot of options. You can make him go big. You can make him go small. You can, lean him forward. That sort of stuff. So it's a really versatile tool that will come in handy in the future. So that's that. Okay, cool. So the other thing I want to talk about now is really going forward, this is pretty straightforward, at least to begin with, right? After you have this layer, you can start to now create more layers, or I guess more cells, right? Until you find yourself happy. In the beginning, it's best to just kind of go by feel, and you definitely will pick up animation tools and tricks and tips as you begin to learn this whole process. But it's best to be kind to yourself and just try and tackle one thing at a time. And now you can also see that as I go to frame 2, I can see the before and after of the onion skinning, which is great. That's exactly what we want. You can adjust the onion skinning by going into animation, and then I believe it's right here. There we go. I always lose track of it, but there's the little pesky bugger. We can click on Show Animation Cells and then click on Onion Skin Settings. And if the little button did not work for you, by the way, in the beginning, if you're like, I don't know why this isn't working, this is also a great place to go, because you can click Enable Onion Skin. So if I disable that, then there's no onion skin for me. But I can click this and it's fine. So that's another way to enable the onion skin. Now, if you click Onion Skin Settings, it will pop up in this window. and you can adjust how many frames you want to see before and after. So if you wanted to only see one frame before, you can have that happen. If you want to see, you know, multiple, I think it goes up to 10, you can do that as well. So it's nice. You can adjust it. You can also adjust the colors and the opacity levels of your frames as well for the onion skin. So let's do that. But a lot of that is personal preference, and really there's no right or wrong to that either. Okay. But before I get too deep into creating frames, because a lot of this is just one after the other and a lot of fun patience, right? But before we really get too much into that, I want to then also talk about adding a background, because this is another thing that can be a common question of any animation software. But in Clip Studio, we want to be a little cautious because there can be some mistakes that make it a little harder for you than it needs to be. So let's go back to the layers, and this is going to kind of circle back to what we were talking about in the beginning, where Clip Studio Paint's layers and frames / cels are connected. And so what this means is if I were to draw, let's say I wanted, you know, some mountains or something. Let's do a better job than that. Right? I want this really beautiful, complicated, gorgeous background, right? And stars, all these things, beautiful, right? But because I drew this on frame 3, once I go back to frame 2, that's all gonna go away. And so you could redraw it every single time, or, you know, we can talk about copy pasting in a bit. Clip Studio makes this a little harder than it needed to be. So instead of doing it this way, what we have to do is create a layer outside of this animation folder. If you look at the layer section right here, I've dragged it out for convenience, but you can keep it where it is in your software. You'll see that there's an animation folder up here at the top. And when I toggle it off, you'll see that it actually changes a little bit of color, and the eye goes off over here in the timeline. So these are connected. Now, if I were to create a new layer in here, because there's no cell down here, this is an invisible layer. I can't see this. So what we need to do, instead of creating any layer in here, we need to create it outside of it. And I found the easiest way to do that is to click on the paper, click on that paper background, and then go over here and click New Raster Layer, right inside this layer box. So not down here, not in the timeline at all. Create it in the layer box. Boom. The way you'll know if it's a layer that's been created inside the folder or not is, well, first of all, if you toggle this little caret symbol in and the layer is still visible, then you know you've done it right. But for example, if it was created in here and then oh, did that wrong. Okay, drag that in there. So let's say that layer was created in there. That layer 1 goes invisible with the rest of the folder, right? So that's not right. And if you have created it in the folder, that's okay. There's a way to remedy this. You just hold down layer 1, you drag it out, and make sure that the whole red bar is spanning the width of the layer box, like so, and drag it out. Okay, so now that we have layer 1, we'll want to draw a background this time. Maybe we'll draw some cemetery stuff. Do a little moon and some stars. Right, you can have fun with it. But now, when we go around here, boom, we've got a little ghost. And the background stays the same. This can work with filling in colors and things like that, but I generally save this only for background layers and or other reference layers. So for example, if I wanted to plan out this guy's motion, if I wanted to say, ooh, I want this guy to go like this. This is a great use for that, because then I can just hide this independently or turn it back on if I need a guide. We'll kind of get into that maybe in a future video if I make one, but for the most part, this is the two reasons I make layers outside of the animation folder. Now, the last little things I really want to talk about are more in regards to, again, the playback speed, adjusting frames, frame rate, and then finally exporting your file out. So, and then maybe we'll talk about animation folders. Once I'm done doing that, I'll want to continue making maybe a few more just to kind of further my point here. Make sure you got the right color here. Some of you might be wondering why I don't just copy paste these little ghosts, especially since the design is similar enough and, you know, he's not necessarily doing anything super different between frames. But I find that one, hand drawing your frames is a lot of fun and it's good practice, but two, I think also Clip Studio Paint has a really annoying copy pasting situation. And so I'll kind of show you that in a second here. Let's say for this next one we were done drawing and we wanted to copy paste. It's not impossible, it's not even that hard, it's just a little annoying and kind of breaks you out of the flow sometimes. So I'm going to go about it like this. And again, this is in regards to the weirdness that Clip Studio Paint has with the connection between layers and the cels. So let's go back to the Layers tab. And you're going to right click, or rather right click making sure that it's on the end of the layer here, right here. And you want to see this. Once you have that, you're going to want to duplicate the layer like this. Then you want to go down to your animation timeline, right? This timeline right here. Go to the new frame, 5. Then you'll click this, specify cell. This is next to the new animation cell button there. So you want to click that, specify cell. Now you're going to see a whole selection, including the new layer that we just made, layer 5. Click that and then click OK. So now you're not necessarily going to be able to tell that you've created a new layer yet until we transform it. Boom. Let's do that again just to kind of hit the point home. Right click on layer 5, duplicate it. Now you're going to see layer 6, but that's not reflected down here in the timeline yet. We must link this new layer to the timeline. So click layers, or I guess cell 6, right? Have the new home ready for the new layer. Then click specify cell, the little link. Click layer 6, click OK. And then transform or move to your choice of location. All right, so now we're starting to see some progress here. If you turn off onion skinning, you can kind of see that this guy is floating along. Boom, 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 boom. But eventually we want to actually play it out. So if we take this little blue bar, for me, I have it quite far out there. I have it to frame 32, but I've only got 6 frames. So I'm going to push this in. Then I'm going to click play. But whoa, he's going so fast. Check that guy out. Way too fast. So in order to slow him down just a bit from Mach speed, I'm going to bring this blue bar out again. And then I'm going to drag this out. These individual frames out one by one. You can also select a bunch of frames by holding down your clicker. And generally you want to hold it down in one of the gray open areas, not on one of the frames. And then drag the right frames that you want and pull them out, like so. This can sometimes be a bit finicky, so you might have to be patient with it. But move them around until you feel like, okay, maybe they've gotten a little bit more space. The other thing to note is that you can change the frame rate once you export. So this is also a good thing to keep in mind. So let's say we want something a little more like this. There's definitely a lot of animation theory about where to put what frames, but for now we're not worrying too much about that. We're just worrying about getting a handle on this software. So let's say we have maybe 2 frames in between each. This is called animating on 2s. And we'll click play. That's a little better. Not perfect, but a little better. He's still moving a little fast. The other thing you might want to check is then also go into animation, this up here, and click playback settings. Sometimes if you click play all frames instead, it's going to play a lot slower than if you were to click, again, animation, playback settings, play in real time. This will show you, again, the real-time speed of your guy. Closer, at the very least. And so, once you've played it back, you can start to adjust depending on how fast or slow you want your animation to be. So I find that this is a great way to start now playing with the timing of your animation. The other thing to note is that besides just the actual frame rate of your piece, so if you have 24 frames per second versus 12 frames per second, that's also going to influence the speed of your animation. But another thing to consider is that one of the animation principles, spacing, also has a huge influence on how fast or how slow your animation goes. So, for example, if I were to have a new frame here, and if I were to suddenly have him go off screen, I click play, he almost teleports. It feels quite jarring, right? And even if I drag this way out there, it still is a bit jarring and abrupt. That jump from over here to over here. And so that means that there's a lot of space in between each of these frames, which also means that there's going to be a big jump for the viewer. There's not as much padding in between each drawing. So that's something to keep in mind when you make your animations as a quick little tip. So let's delete this though. Okay. Now, let's say maybe we are happy with this. We're like, yes, we would like to export. The biggest thing to exporting is going to be going up to File, clicking Export Animation, and then you have a choice of image sequence, GIF, sticker, or movie. I'll be honest, I've never used animated sticker before, so I can't really speak to that, but I can speak to image sequence, GIF, and movie. If you plan to use a compositing software like Premiere or something else similar, image sequence is a great tool to use. This is also great in case you want to combine a background that you made in Photoshop with an animation you make in Clip Studio. That's something that you can kind of experiment with. But it does mean that every single frame is going to then be exported as a unique image. So I won't do this, but just kind of walking through it with you. You can then choose a file and other things in here to kind of show where all the images are going to go, which makes a lot of sense. You can also choose, PNG if you want something transparent, or JPEG if you just want something flat. You can also adjust a lot of settings here. So you can adjust the quality settings of the JPEG, and you can choose whether to output the frame, the overflow frame, which is a little bit past this blue here, or the entire canvas. You can also click Apply 2D Camera Effects, which applies to maybe future projects once you experiment with the 2D camera. You can also choose to export certain frames. Usually it will default select from the first frame to the last frame of your blue bar here. And you can also adjust the frame rate. But let's talk a little bit about other things as well. So you can also export as a GIF. This is great for short animations and for checking your work along the way, because I find that it exports quite quickly. So you can just export the name. You can say a little ghosty, click save. And then it's going to pop up with this where you can choose the width and the height. You can choose the just project settings file size that you'd like, or you can copy this, as I find that 560 by 315 is a decently small size that generally is a little faster at exporting. Similarly, you can also choose the export range and the frames per second. So you can change it up there. You can also choose the loop count, and you can choose how many times you want it to loop in case you don't want an infinite looping GIF. Click OK. And usually it takes no time at all to get it started. Once we open it up, and boom. Okay, movie is a similar process. You can also click export animation and click movie. You can choose between AVI and MP4. Click either apply 2D camera effects or not. This doesn't matter to us right now. And choose the frame rate as well. Okay. Once it loads, you can now see that we've exported it. Beautiful. So those are kind of the basic like major things that you need to know about animating in Clip Studio Paint. The last thing that maybe I'll touch on as just a quick bonus is if you wanted to, for example, add a background to this little ghost here. So say, for example, you can kind of see the moon through him, right? So if we wanted to edit that, the way I would go about it, there's a couple ways to go about it, but what I would do is, this is where we get into creating a new animation folder. So I would usually do this after I'm completely done with my animation. I'm all ready. I'm like, okay, I want to finish this. So I would click new animation folder, like so. And it's going to create it, and underneath or above your animation folder. I'm going to recommend making sure that this is going to be below your line art animation folder. If you've ever made digital art, this is going to make a lot of sense because you know that you want to stack the line art on top of any sort of color or fill layer that you create after the fact. So once you have this new animation folder here below, and you can move it by going over to the layers section and just moving the new one manually. So if it's up here, you want to just drag that down here. Then you can create a new cell with this button, like we've done before. Now, what we'll do is, using the color of your choice, let's say we want to make this ghost, I don't know, let's make it purple so you can see it. Usually what I like to do is select a very opaque pen. So for example, I'll take, Milli pen is great, but you can also use a brush as well. I'm going to draw the border of this guy, and then using the fill tool here, so over here, this paint bucket or the fill tool, you can fill him in. Other ways that you can do this is you can also use the lasso tool. A lot of times in the default, I think it starts out as the rectangle tool, so right here it'll start as selection area rectangle. But in the subtool, you can change it to the lasso tool, and this acts more of like just literally a lasso that you can select any random shape and fill it in. So if I were to do that, let's say, instead of highlighting it with the pen, I can use my marquee or the lasso, and using this, I can drag around Mr. Ghost and fill him in. And you can fill him in, again, using this little toolbox over here on the side, or the nice thing that happens with Clip Studio Paint is they actually give you a menu of useful options to select from, and the fill tool is one of these things. So if you press that, it'll automatically fill it. And then over here, you can deselect it. So then you just adjust to your liking. Okay, and now what I like to do is then hop to the next area where there's a frame in my line art layer. So if you look here, you can see frame 2 in this first folder that we made. But you want to go to that same area with your red bar here, click that, and create a new cell right there. So now both of the frame 2s, or cell 2, here and here, are in the same place. Then we're going to do that same thing. Fill it in, adjust, and repeat. You can use the copy pasting that we talked about earlier. So if you wanted to right click this, duplicate, find layer 3, or I guess cell 3, right? But make sure again that you're in the correct folder. This might be a good opportunity to actually name your folders, because this can be helpful. So going over to the layers, if you want to rename anything, just double click. I'll type in line art, and then I'll double click, and this will be color. Right? And then that way it's very obvious both over here in this area and over here in the left corner of the timeline. You can kind of see, like, okay, this is my color timeline and this is my line art timeline. So then I'm going back to the duplication process. So let's delete that. So I'll start over. You're gonna right click layer 2, duplicate, link, so specify cell, click layer 3, click OK, and then using the transform tool, drag it into place. And sometimes, depending on if you redrew the frame or not, you might have to do a bit of adjustments. Boom, boom, boom. But this goes quite a bit faster this way, I will say. So if this works for you and your plans, I would recommend using the duplication mostly for stuff like this, as it comes in handy. Cool. Now when we play it back, beautiful, there he is. All right, and then we can export. And we can take a look. Perfect. Okay. So those are the main things that you want to consider when animating in Clip Studio Paint for the very first time. There are many things that you can do in this software as far as animation goes, and I highly encourage people to really experiment and play around with this software, as it is very robust. And I find that you can do almost full compositing from start to finish, from storyboard to the end, animations in this software. So there's no reason to delay and have fun.